Chapter 9. At the end of a broad, once tree-lined avenue bordered by massive houses, stood the Denis Gatehouse. It was a huge, squat, square thing with twin turrets and a pair of massive, studded doors that were closed against them. On the great slab of a lintel above the doors, 2 Denis words had been cut deeply into the ancient stone. Looking up at it, Atrus translated in his head, District of Jitairi. Stepping up to the left-hand door, Gen braced himself, then leaned against it, straining against it, but despite his efforts it did not move even the tiniest amount. Gen turned, looking about him, then walked across, venturing into the garden of one of the nearby houses to emerge a moment later with a heavy-looking piece of metal, clearly the ornamental spout of a fountain. Standing before the doors again, Gen lifted the thick rod of metal high and then swung it against the wood, aiming for the lock. There was a cracking sound and splinters flew, but the door held firm. Grunting loudly, Gen raised the spout time and again, smashing it against the door, the wood splintering more and more each time. Finally, on the 7th or 8th blow, the lock fell away. Gen threw the spout down, then, leaning against the door, he heaved his whole body, straining his neck muscles taut. Slowly, but surely, the massive door eased back. They went through into Jitairi. The buildings here were smaller, but much better maintained than the district they had left. It both had the same feeling of immense age, of ancient histories piled up layer upon layer like geological strata. In places where it had not been replaced, the stone floor of the lanes was so worn by the passage of millions of feet over the millennia that it dipped markedly in the center, its appearance fluid like wax that had melted and reformed. The likeness reinforced by the deep, dark red of the stone. Coming to a massive crossroads, a place where covered walkways crisscrossed overhead and tunnels dipped darkly into the earth, Gen stopped and took the small tanned leather notebook from his pocket, studying it closely. Atrus had often noticed Gen consulting the book, which seemed to contain information on all manner of things, yet strangely he had never seen him write in it. Maybe he does it at night when I'm not there, Atrus thought, thinking of his own journal. Or maybe he doesn't need to. Maybe he's already mapped out where everything is in this city. To be honest, he was in awe of his father's knowledge of the capital. Gen seemed to know every street, every important detail, and every building in Denis. And even when he didn't, he was sure to have it in his book. Closing the notebook, Gen pointed up the avenue to his left. We need to go this way. The main square is 10 minutes' walk from here. Atrus waited as Gen tucked the book away and then set off again, silently following his father, staring about him as he walked. The houses in Jitairi were richly furnished. Not only that, but there was a huge pentagonal stone shields on many of the houses, decorated with symbols identical to those on Gen's tunic the night he had come to the cleft to claim Atrus. Curious, Atrus had asked Gen what they were and had discovered that they were guild badges, and that those who lived in those houses displayed them because they were senior guild members. Jitairi, it transpired, had been a guild district, and thus something of an anomaly in that the families that had once stayed there were not from the locality but were drafted in to oversee guild activities in the lower districts. The houses were very different in Jitairi, more elaborate in their design. Some of them reminded Atrus of the forms he had glimpsed on the caverns traveling to Denis, seemed to mimic the form of dripstone and flowstone, narrow towers pushing up from the walls like great stalagmites, while large draperies of lace-like stone decorated their front arches. Others, much more prevalent, were constructed to resemble great slabs of rock, 3 or 4 stories resting one atop another like layers of smooth slate. No sign of any doors or windows evident to the casual eye. 2 of the bigger houses stood out, not just because of their imposing design, but also because they were made of the jet-black, red-streaked stone that he had noticed was used mainly in the uppermost levels of the city. And again, he asked Gen what, if anything, this signified. These were the houses of important men, Gen had answered distractedly. Only the very rich could afford to build with such materials. The avenue opened out into a massive square, enclosed by high stone walls, on the far side of which was a building that resembled the steward's house. 6 broad white marble steps led up into the shadowed portico. Remarkably, its facade had survived the quake almost intact. On the top step, Atrus turned, looking out across the labyrinth of walls and rooftops toward the harbor far below, the great arch dominating the skyline, its top almost level with them. Then turning back, he stepped up into the shadows of the common library. Inside, beyond a row of 5 cracked pillars, was a small entrance hall, its floor covered in a mosaic. A dark, jagged crack ran through the center of it, but the pictures were still clear. It showed a man standing beside a lantern on which lay an open book, exactly like the books which stood on the pedestals in his father's library back on Kavir. The man's hand hovered just above the image on the page. On the far side of the hall were 2 doorways, one to the left and one on the right. Cut into the plinth over the left-hand door was the Denis symbol for enter, while the plinth on the right had the same symbol. While on the plinth to the right, the same symbol had a circle around it, from which jutted 7 short wedge-shaped rays, like a star. From Anna's lessons, he recognized it as a Denis negative. That sign read, "Do not enter." He went to the left-hand door. It opened into a long, caged passageway with ornately latticed sides of interwoven bronze and iron that were directly down the middle of a much bigger sloping corridor, the cracked walls of which were covered in carvings of open fields and blazing suns, of men and women standing in those fields wearing strange glasses. His glasses, Atrus realized with a start of surprise, as they looked up into the limitless, unfamiliar heavens. At the end of their caged walk was a barrier. Gen vaulted it effortlessly and walked on into a big, high-ceilinged gallery on the far side of which was a massive stone screen. Behind that could be seen 3 tall, black-painted doors. Atrus climbed over the barrier and then went across, joining his father. "Over there, through those doors, is the book room," Gen said. "From there, the common people of Denis would have the opportunity of traveling to an age." He looked at Atrus, clearly proud of his race's achievements. "Did everybody use these places?" Gen shook his head. "No, that's why they're called common libraries. These places were for common, working men and women of Denis. The great families had their own books, their own ages. They were rigidly administered by the guilds, just as these ages were, yet they were exclusive. Only they permitted by the families could enter them." Atrus frowned. "And the harvest worlds? Those were guild worlds. The books they used were specialized books, much less restrictive than the ordinary books. They had to be to take the great loads that were regularly brought back from those ages." Gen gestured toward the doors. "Anyway, let us go inside." Following his father, Atrus went around the screen and through the central doorway into a big, long chamber filled with pedestals, divided in 2 by a central walkway, the whole thing mounted on a huge white marble dais. Barely half of the pedestals now stood, and the great dais itself was riven with cracks. There was no ceiling to the chamber, but overlooking it was a railed balcony, part of which had fallen away. Even so, looking up at it, Atrus could imagine the cloaked guild members standing there like gods, calmly supervising the comings and goings down below. Atrus stepped up beside his father. On the nearest pedestal lay an open book, its thick leather cover secured to the lectern by a heavy gold chain. "Here they are," Atrus said. Gen looked at him. "No, these are of no use to us." Atrus frowned, not understanding, but Gen had crouched and was examining the top one of the elaborately decorated pedestals, his fingers feeling beneath the beveled edge. With a huff of disappointment, he straightened up, moving quickly on to the next, examining that again with the same response. While he was doing so, Atrus stepped up to the pedestal and looked down at the image on the right-hand page. He frowned. It was dark, only the vaguest outline visible. Then he understood. There was a thick layer of dust over the window, suspended just a fraction above the page. He went to touch it, to brush it aside, but Gen, who had seen what he was about to do, grabbed his hand and pulled it away, gripping it tightly and shaking it as he spoke. "You must never do that, Atrus, never. You understand? For all you know, that age might be dead, destroyed in some calamity. You would have been drawn into an airless void. I'm sorry, Atrus said, his voice very small. Gen sighed and then released his hand. The art can be a dangerous thing, Atrus. That's why the Denis took great precautions to protect these books and ensure they were not misused. Misused? But Gen had already moved away, searching again. He was crouched down, studying the edge of one of the pedestals in the second row. Atrus, come over here. Atrus frowned, but did as he was told, stepping up beside his father. I want you to search all of these pedestals for a catch or a switch of some kind. Father? Gen pointed at the door at the far end of the chamber. We need to go inside. Somewhere here there is a switch or lever that will let us in. Atrus set to work, examining the pedestals one after another until, with a little cry of excitement, he found a tiny brass hemisphere set into the back of one of the great stone lecterns. He pressed it. At once the door on the far side of the room slid open. Good, Gen said, straightening and made his way across. Is this it? Atrus said, standing up in the doorway, staring with disappointment into what seemed like an unfurnished corner from which no doors led out. Unfurnished corridor from which no doors led out. No, Gen said, turning to look back into the main gallery. The book room is below. I hoped the trap door would be open, but it looks like we shall have to force our way in. As his father stepped out again, Atrus moved past him, noticing for the first time in the big square slab of stone that hung like a painting against the left-hand wall. Standing before it, Atrus frowned. From its smooth surface protruded a number of geometric symbols, stars and semicircles, triangles, squares, several others, arranged in what appeared to be a haphazard fashion. Atrus squinted at it, trying to make out what it was he had noticed. There was a pattern. No, not a pattern, a progression. Each symbol had a mathematical value, and if you took those values, a map. It was a map. Gen came back into the room, carrying one of the fallen pedestals, his muscles straining as he kept the massive piece of marble balanced against his chest and shoulder. Out of the way, he gasped, then, lifting the huge stone with both hands, heaved it right through the middle of the slab embedded in the wall. But father, mind back, boy, Gen said, ignoring him, grasping the pedestal once again and beginning to extricate it from the wall, heaving at it and rocking it back and forth until it came free. But I could have solved the puzzle, Atrus said silently as his father threw the pedestal aside, revealing behind the slab a matrix of metal pulleys and wires. He watched as his father pulled and pushed at the wires, trying to work the mechanisms that activated the trap door. For a moment, there was nothing, and then with a resounding click, as something slotted into place. Stand over by the door, Atrus, Gen said, gesturing to him with one hand and the other buried deep inside the workings of the mechanism. Atrus did as he was told, and then watched as his father made a small little movement of the shoulder. There was a hiss of hydraulics and then a low grating sound. A moment later, a 2x3 rectangle of the floor began to sink into the earth, and with a loud hissing noise, revealing a stairway. Atrus followed his father down into the large, well-lit space, filled with long workbenches piled high with all manner of clutter. Shelves crowded the walls. 8 cloaked skeletons sat in their chairs, slumped forward over their work. Another, their supervisor, lay where he had fallen against the far wall. What is this place? Atrus asked, sniffing the musty air, noting that the seated skeletons were chained to their desks. This is the main book room, Gen answered. But there was no sign of any books in the chamber. The shelves were crowded with all manner of things, boxes and bottles, papers and files, tools for writing and carving, but no books. Of books, at least the kind that Gen seemed to want, there were no signs. There were only those upstairs, and it was clear that Gen did not want them. Atrus stared at his father, confused, but Gen was looking about purposefully, searching the nearest shelves as if he might unearth real treasures here. What should I look for? He asked after a moment. Gen turned, staring at him as if he had forgotten he was there, then gestured to a door to the back of the room, behind the stairway they'd come down. Have a look in there, Atrus. There should be a narrow passageway with 4 or 5 rooms off of it. One of them will be the bookstore. If it is locked, call me, but it should be open. They would not have had time to lock it. No, Atrus thought, beginning to understand how quickly catastrophe had fallen upon the Denis. At night, so his father said, while most decent folk were in their beds. Gen turned away, rummaging among the shelves, stopping to take out a strange-looking glass vial and shake it, then throwing it aside. Atrus watched him a moment longer, and then went through, finding it exactly as Gen had described. The passageway was 8 paces long, 2 doors led off to the left, 2 to the right, and 1 directly ahead. He tried the first, noting the Denis book symbol cut into the center of the elaborate carved pattern on the polished wooden surface. The door swung back silently on its hinges at his touch. Inside was the tiniest of rooms, almost a cupboard, it was so small, with broad shelves on all 3 sides, reaching up into the ceiling space well above his head. Most of those were empty, but on one of the higher shelves there were 8 of the big leather-bound books. Atrus reached up and pulled one down, a red-covered book, surprised by how heavy it was, as if it was made of something more than paper. Then kneeling, he placed it on the floor in front of him and opened it. Nothing. The pages were blank. Disappointed, he closed the book and slipped it back into place, then took another, this time with a pale green leather cover. This, too, proved blank. One by one, he took the books down, certain that he would find at least one that had something written in it, but they were all, as far as he could see, the same. Defeated, he placed one of the books beneath his arm and went outside, walking back down the passageway despondently. Gen had cleared a spot on one side of the workbenches and was bent over what looked like a wooden tray filled with a dozen or so large amber-colored ink pots. After a moment, he straightened, holding up one of the big 5-sided crystals to examine it, its rich amber color reflecting in Gen's pallid face. Then, noticing Atrus standing there, he looked across. "Well, did you find any?" "It's no good," Atrus said, steeling himself against his father's anger. "There's nothing in them." Putting the ink pot back in the case, Gen came and took the book from Atrus. "Here, let me see that." He opened it and flicked through a number of pages, then looked up again. "This is fine. This is just what I was looking for. Are there others?" Atrus went to shake his head, then nodded, utterly confused now. "But I thought you just wanted ones with ages in them. These are just books." Gen laughed. "No, Atrus. These are not just books. These are Cortanaya, blank books, waiting to be written." "Written?" Atrus stared at his father. Gen unslung his knapsack and slid the book inside, then looked to Atrus again. "How many books are in there at the store?" 8? "Good. Then bring them back in here. There's ink in here," he said, gesturing toward the case of amber-colored pots. "And pens, too. So we have everything we need. Come then. Quick now, boy. We can be home in time for supper."